Managers. What is the worst excuse an employee has used to call off work? Not a manager, but at my retail store, we had a new manager transferred in from another store. He worked for a week with us and then went on vacation. This is normal, by the way. Usually when a manager transfers from another store, they take a week of vacation before coming. But this guy took it later. Anyway, he said he was taking a trip to Puerto Rico. A week goes by, and then another. He was only supposed to be gone for one. We start calling him, wondering what's going on. No answer. Then as we are approaching the third week, his family starts calling and asking if he's at work. He went missing, went on vacation, and never came back. I can only hope his story has a happy ending, because we never heard from him again.
That's a wild situation. You'd think a manager would keep in touch, especially after just starting. It's strange how someone can just disappear like that. I wonder what happened. Maybe he had personal issues or something unexpected came up. It definitely leaves everyone in a tough spot, not knowing if he's okay or if he just decided to start fresh somewhere else. Not much closure in that story.
I think this might be relevant, kind of the other side of the coin. Back in the day when I was working at Cookout, I walked in about noon. Had to stay till 10 p.m. I was there, I was working, but I wasn't happy about it. I was working the grill, and my boss comes by and says, "Josh, you look unhappy, what's up?" I chuckled and said, "If I'm being perfectly honest, I always watch the Twilight Zone marathon on New Year's Day. It's like a tradition. Just a little bummed, but I'm fine." He walked away, went in the back, and made a phone call. Comes back over to me, asks for the spatula, and says, "Go home and watch the Twilight Zone. Dave is coming in, I got this till he gets here." I was like, "Are you serious right now?" He just smiled and said, "I fucking love the Twilight Zone. Go enjoy not being a manager." Great fucking guy.
That's a solid story. It's nice to hear about bosses who actually care. Sounds like you had a good connection with him. Sometimes just having that small moment of understanding can really make a difference in a tough day. It's cool that he gave you the chance to take a break and enjoy something you love. Little gestures like that stick with you. Definitely a nice memory to have from those workdays.
When I was managing in a fast food restaurant, this one guy told me that he needs to go home early. I asked him why, and he said because Raw wrestling was on tonight. Then he explained to me who was fighting, and then told me the story of why they were fighting using quotes and sound effects. He was 43.
Yeah, that sounds pretty typical for a wrestling fan. It's funny how some people get so into those storylines, even as adults. I've seen folks just drop everything for their favorite shows. It's like, for them, it's the big event of the week. Can't blame him for wanting to catch the action live, though. Wrestlers definitely have a way of drawing people in.
Working in tech in California. I came in one day, and my boss told my co-worker won't be coming in anymore. I asked why, and he said because of the nuclear power leak in Japan after the earthquake. She was fearful of radiation coming overseas. So in urgency, they jumped on a plane and went to the East Coast for safety. She asked permission to work abroad. My boss said, "We can give you 1-2 weeks there," and she said no. Never saw her again. They didn't have any job out there. I don't know what they did. They did have a kid to feed, though.
That's an interesting situation. It's wild how fear can drive people to make drastic decisions, especially over something like a nuclear incident that's far away. It's a tough spot for her to be in. I guess priorities change when family is involved. Not knowing what happened afterward leaves you wondering about her choices and if it all worked out. It's a reminder of how unpredictable life can be.
About 15 years ago, I was running a fast food restaurant and had this lady that worked for me that was a really good employee. She never called out and always did a great job. So when she called out, I was really worried. She called at around 9 a.m. and said she wouldn't make it in today. The call went about like this. Employee: "Hey boss, I ain't coming into work today," in a nervous voice. "Boss, are you okay?" "You've never called in before." Employee: "Yeah, the doc says I'll be fine." I was bleeding out of my butthole last night, so I went to the ER. They said I had a fizzle or something like that. I guess I have two assholes now, boss. Feel better and let me know when you can be back." She healed up and came back to work about a week later, and I never could look her without thinking of her saying she had two assholes.
That's a wild story. It's always surprising when something like that happens with an employee you trust. You just expect them to show up, not drop a bomb like that. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for her to even share that. But it's good she healed up and came back to work. I guess from then on, you had a unique way of remembering her.
Not a manager, just a firefighter in New England. My deputy chief recorded a fellow coworker calling out during the Boston Bruins playoff run. He called up at 1 a.m. completely hammered, telling the deputy chief that he couldn't come in for his shift at 7 a.m. because he had Bruins fever. He proceeded to yell, "It's took a time," and hung up. My deputy chief was beside himself, asked no questions, and put him out sick.
That's a classic move. Sounds like your coworker really let that team spirit get to him. I mean, who needs sleep when there's a playoff game to celebrate? It's wild how a sport can turn someone into a night owl. The deputy chief must have had a good laugh about it later. At least they handled it without much fuss. Hope the Bruins enjoyed his support, even if he couldn't show up to work.
Years ago, I had someone call in and tell me that they couldn't come to work this week because they were grounded. They were 25 years old at the time. I told them that this wasn't an acceptable excuse and that they would be expected to work their scheduled shifts. So he put his mom on the phone and we had a nice long chat. He did live at home and she was grounding him and said if we couldn't respect her parenting decisions, then he quit. I kind of felt bad for the kid.
That's an interesting situation. It's wild how some people still let their parents control them at that age. Can't imagine calling in and having mom step in like that. It must have been tough for him, trying to balance adult responsibilities with being grounded. At the same time, you have to draw the line with work. Just a reminder that some people never really leave home.
TLDR, Rabbit Fox. When I was in Colorado, I lived in an apartment with a hallway open to the outdoors. The lady across the hall had a very bad habit of putting smelly trash outside her door until she felt like carrying it to the dumpster. A few of us complained a lot, but the apartment complex never did anything about it. One day, I was rushing out my door to get to work, and when I opened my door, there was a fox eating her trash. I tried to shoo it away, but it got really aggressive and backed me up into my apartment. I shut the door laughing for a minute and figured it would eat and be on its way. Opened the door a few minutes later, and it is still there, growling at my door. Went on like this for a while, and I called into work telling them that I would be late. Too bad this was before cell phones had cameras, or I would have snapped a pic. Also called animal control because I thought it might have been rabid. It was not normal behavior. About an hour later, I was able to leave my apartment and go to work.
That's a wild story. Not every day you get held hostage by a fox. The trash situation really didn't help either. It's funny how a small thing like that can turn into a bigger hassle, though. I can imagine how stressful it must have been to deal with that in the morning rush. At least you got a decent story out of it for later. Glad you made it to work eventually.
I had an employee tell me he had to go home because he had an abscess on his gum. Curiously, I asked if he could show me. He had a fat chaw on his lip and claimed that was the abscess. I literally face-palmed. Another employee said she was car sick and couldn't come into work. I replied, "You mean hungover?" She refused and really pushed to miss work. I worked a triple shift because of her. Thanks, Cassie.
That's a rough day at work. It's always interesting how people try to get out of their responsibilities. The gum abscess story is a real surprise, and it's funny how some just can't be honest. That Cassie situation seems tough too. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder about people's priorities. Working a triple shift just because someone else doesn't want to show up can be frustrating.
I don't know if the excuse was real or not. I assumed it was because I never saw him again. But when I called an employee because he was no-show for his shift, either a housemate or family member, this was over a decade ago, so I don't recall, told me that the employee couldn't come into work because he was in jail.
That's kind of a wild excuse. You'd think they'd just say they were sick or something. Not showing up for work because you're in jail is next level. It makes you wonder what kind of trouble they got into. Probably lost a job over it too. Seems like a tough way to learn a lesson. Can't really blame them though, life can take some unexpected turns.
I used to work at a well-known multinational coffee chain whose name starts with S and ends in Tarbucks. The stores are open on Christmas Day, but no one can be scheduled for the shift. You volunteer, good pay, and crazy tips, so they usually have no problem. Anyway, this one guy from another store volunteered to work Christmas Day. Christmas morning, the store gets a phone call from his MOM saying he's not coming in because she doesn't want him to work on Christmas.
That sounds pretty wild. I can imagine the chaos that must have caused at the store. People rely a lot on the holiday shifts, and then to have someone bail last minute like that, especially on Christmas, is just something else. It's funny how a mom can have that kind of influence, even when the person is an adult. That day must have been interesting for everyone involved.
Most horrifying call-out I happened to overhear. I'm in our scheduling office, and I'm doing some kind of paperwork for a vacation request or something. The phone rings, and one of the schedulers picks up the phone. There is hysterical sobbing and screaming, a lot of okay, calm down. Just take the day off. I'll cover it. Calm down. I give the scheduler a weird look. She hangs up the phone. Apparently, a girl woke up to her period. Bled all over her new white sheets. Soaked into her mattress. Ruined her underwear and pajamas. And to make matters worse, she didn't have any tampons. Her car was in the shop, and she only had her bike. I felt terrible for her. I asked who it was. As luck would have it, I knew the girl. Lived in the same apartment complex as me. Drove to the store about 15 minutes later, bought enough pads and tampons, toilet paper, and Midol to last her for a whole week, and dropped it off. I was a superhero for that day. Felt cool.
That was quite a situation. It's rough when unexpected things happen, especially like that. I mean, waking up to a mess and not having what you need is stressful. It's nice you stepped up to help though. Bringing over supplies is a solid move. Little moments like that show what kind of friend you are. Helping out in tough times can really make someone's day a lot better.
I have two from the same employee. She called in one day because she didn't have any clean shirts for work. I told her to come in anyway, and I'd give her a new one. The very next day she called in because she said she was at the lake and sat in an ant pile and couldn't come in because she had ants in her pants.
That's a pretty wild excuse for not showing up. It's funny how sometimes people come up with the most random reasons to call in sick. The clean shirt thing is understandable, but ants in her pants? That's next level. You can't help but laugh at that kind of creativity, even if it's a bit much. It makes you curious if she really meant it or just didn't want to come in again.
My manager told me that at his old store, this new guy called in and was like, "Guys, my iPod broke. Y'all don't understand. If I have to go without my music, I'ma go nuts. Y'all don't get it. I'm serious. This ain't funny." The great thing is the store we work at fixes cell phones and iPods and the like.
It's funny how people can get so attached to their tech. I remember a time when a friend freaked out because his phone died during a trip. He said it was like losing a lifeline. We ended up finding a charger, but the panic was real. It shows how much we rely on our devices. Got to love the little things that keep us connected, though.
Well, I'm not a manager, but I had to call my boss and tell him my best friend and I wouldn't be coming in for a couple days. It went pretty much like this. "Manager, you can't call in for me, but dash manager. He has to call in for himself. or he's a no-call, no-show, me dash, Bert, you don't understand. Manager. Now I'm gonna be short 2 servers. Jesus, what's the excuse anyway? Me. Joey is laying in a hospital bed next to me because someone tried to kill him. He's stable, but we're waiting to hear from the surgeon about pulling out the broken glass that's lodged in his jawbone. Here, let me send you a picture of his slashed-up face. Manager. No, that's not necessarily. Just try to find someone to cover one of your shifts. Is he all right? Me. No, Bert, he is definitely not all right. Click.
That's a rough situation. Calling your boss about a friend's serious injury is tough. It's wild how some people focus on the rules instead of the reality. Your manager probably freaked out when he realized this was serious. It's hard to find the right words in moments like that. It's a reminder that sometimes life hits hard, and priorities shift in a blink. Hoping for a good recovery for Joey.
Used to be a manager of a fairly large, very low-paying call center. Had one girl who we had just hired call me, in tears, telling me that she had just been stabbed by her baby daddy and wouldn't be able to come to work. I'm a bit shocked and tell her not to worry about work and to make sure she and her kid get stuff figured out. 2 days later, she shows up at work and is showing off her stab wound. Turns out she had just gone out drinking and somehow cut her lower abdomen. A lot of square footage there, could have been anything, and decided to turn lemons into lemonade. I got lied to all the time when people were calling out, but I kind of resented this one because she had made me get all worried about her and stuff.
That sounds like a rough situation. It's wild how people can twist a story to get some sympathy. I mean, getting stabbed is a big deal. To find out it was just a partying accident is kind of messed up. It's like, why put someone through that stress when it wasn't even real? Just shows how some people can be. You dealt with a lot in that job for sure.
Background. I used to live in a very rural area. The worst excuse I ever heard was this 17-year-old kid who had his friend call and claiming to be his uncle, to say that he was needed at home because the cows had gotten out and needed to be rounded up. The manager that took the call told the employee, "I don't believe this for a second, but I can't stop you from leaving." He stayed and finished his shift.
That's a pretty wild excuse. I mean, who would think to use cows as a reason to bail on work? It kind of speaks to the lengths people go for a break. That manager must have seen a lot of things to just shrug it off. It's a rural setting, so maybe people are used to odd situations. The kid probably thought he was clever, but it didn't really pan out.
Grocery store manager here. I once had a girl that didn't show up one day, and late the day after until I saw her bruises. Nothing crazy, just one on her face and neck that I saw. I asked WTF happened, and she starts crying and said her dad had beat the shit out of her in a fight she was having about her newborn daughter. Girl was an absolute sweetheart, and I offered to help her out and even stay at my house if needed. She refused and quit the following week without notice. I hope she's doing all right. On the flip side, had another girl call in and say she'll be late. I say no problem, we're not busy. She gets there, and I mildly inquired what happened. OMG, there was a sale I couldn't walk away from at Plato's Closet. I've been there all morning. My face must have been priceless. One girl couldn't walk away from her sale. One got beat up by her dad. The fuck?
It's a tough situation. People go through so much, and you never really know what's happening behind the scenes. The contrast between the two girls is striking. One is dealing with a serious issue at home, while the other is all about shopping. It makes you realize how life can be so different for everyone. Hope the first girl finds support, and the second one, well, she just loves a good deal.
I used to answer the management line as I worked the night shift, and people would call in early to say they weren't in. There were lots of people who'd clearly been on a night out and got in at 5/6 a.m. and just calling sick. The best, though, was a guy whose conversion went like this. "It's Bob. He wasn't really Bob. I'm not going to be in today. Can you let my manager know?" "Yeah, sure. What's the problem?" "I'm in jail. They've got the wrong person. They should have arrested my brother, but they don't believe I have a twin." I'm using my one phone call to let you know I probably won't be in.
That's a wild call to get. I can only imagine how calm you had to stay. I mean, getting a call from someone in jail saying they're mistaken for their twin is pretty unique. You have to wonder if he really had a twin or if it was just a cover. It's one of those moments that sticks with you, just another day on the night shift.
Had an employee call me at 11 p.m. on a Sunday night. Drunk, crying. My girlfriend was in a car accident. I can't be in tomorrow. She's going to the hospital, and I have to be there. This is a guy that called in once every 2 weeks, so I press for info. Oh no, is she okay or seriously hurt? I don't know, he replies. How's she getting to the hospital? I ask. I don't know. Did she call you and tell you she was in an accident? I asked, her sister called me. The car is totaled. She's hurt bad. I let him have the day off cause I'm not an asshole. But I don't believe him. He comes by Tuesday and gives me more bullshit about the accident. About a week after that, I see he drove a different car to work. I ask about the new car. He says it's his girlfriend's car. I say it's already fixed. He says fix. I fired him.
That's rough. Sounds like he was in a tough spot, but it's hard to trust someone who calls in with a story like that, especially late at night. People can be messy. I guess you did the right thing by giving him a day off, but when the story doesn't add up, it makes it easy to question everything. Loyalty matters in a job, and he didn't really show that.
One guy called to say he couldn't come to work because he was waiting for the heating oil company to make an emergency delivery and restart his oil-fired furnace. A fellow employee who had just been there to his place said, "That's odd because he lives in an apartment with electric baseboard heat."
That's kind of funny. I had a friend who did something similar. He called in sick because he said he was dealing with a plumbing issue at home. But then another friend who was in the area saw him out and about. Turns out he just didn't want to show up that day. Sometimes people make excuses instead of just owning up to it. You know how it goes.
We had a new cook at our restaurant a couple years ago. This guy was probably mid to late 20s, and he just wasn't very good at his job. Through his 3 training days, it was obvious that he was going to struggle to keep up with the pace once he was working on his own. His first shift on his own comes on a semi-busy Friday night, and he just couldn't get through it. Other cooks had to step over when they were available and help him put together his salads and apps. By the end of the night, he was definitely crying a bit. The next day he calls in and says he has to quit because he has cancer. It's tough to question cancer, but that was some interesting timing.
That's a rough situation. The new guy clearly had a tough time adjusting, and then to hear about his cancer after all that. It's hard to know what to think. You can't really question someone's health, but the timing definitely raises some eyebrows. I can't imagine the pressure he felt, especially on that first shift. It's a weird mix of sympathy and confusion, you know? Just a lot to unpack there.
I had this one shared with me by my manager. For context, our shift started at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. A coworker called in at 4 a.m. that Tuesday morning and said that they had court out of state and couldn't make it. Our speculation is that they got arrested out of state because you would know something like that a while in advance.
That's a pretty wild situation. Starting a shift at 3 a.m. is tough enough, and then having someone bail last minute raises questions. The idea that they might have been arrested is just a whole other layer. It makes you wonder how often this kind of thing happens. Just goes to show, you never really know what's going on in someone else's life, especially at that hour.
I heard a lot of excuses while managing a sports bar last year. The best and most understandable was when one of my servers called to tell me they met a loaded music producer at a party the night before. They fell in love/hooked up, and she was at a BMW dealership picking out a new car he was paying for. I was very skeptical. She never worked another shift, but did stop by a few weeks later to show off the car and registration in her name.
That's a wild story. You hear a lot of things when you manage a place like that. People come up with all sorts of reasons for missing work. But this one hits different. It's hard to believe at first, but then she shows up with an actual car. Guess sometimes, luck just finds you in the most unexpected ways. Good for her, I guess.
For 3 Saturdays in a row, I had a male employee say he needed to leave because he had morning sickness. This was only on Saturdays. For his afternoon shift, he had no visible signs of sickness or having recently vomited. Heard this from other managers who let him leave. If I'd have been there, he would have worked his whole shift and wouldn't have left a minute early. He didn't last long.
Sounds like he was using that excuse pretty cleverly. It's interesting how some people think they can get away with things like that. I guess the other managers were lenient, but it's clear he didn't have a strong work ethic. It's probably for the best he didn't stick around. Shows that sometimes people can't hide who they really are for too long.
I live in the South, so some people don't handle winter weather very well. We always have call-ins when there is a very small amount of snow or ice, but by far the worst example was when one employee called in to say that his apartment stairs were too icy and that he was afraid that he would slip. This was an early 20s, very able-bodied man, and it was quite obvious that he just didn't want to come in.
That makes sense. I've seen similar things happen. People sometimes really don't want to deal with work when the weather gets bad, even if it's not a huge deal. I remember a friend who used to call in for just a bit of rain. It's like, come on, just grab an umbrella and get on with it. But I get it, some folks just don't want to deal with the hassle.
He called in about 15 minutes after his shift had started to tell me that his unit was being deployed and he needed the day off to pack and get ready. I asked him if he could fax/email a copy of his orders so I could get his time off approved through home office. I hear nothing for 3 days from him. No calls, no answering messages, nothing. I call the local National Guard unit, and they've never heard of him or show any record of him being enlisted at all. I called his cell one last time to ask him if he had a return date. Never got a response, never heard from him again. I guess his unit was so covert that he just vanished from employment completely.
That's a wild story. It's strange how someone can just disappear like that. I had a friend do something similar once. He said he was going on a secret trip for work but just stopped showing up. No calls, no texts. A few months later, I ran into him at a store. He brushed it off like it was nothing. Some people just like to keep things mysterious, I guess.
Other side of the proverbial coin. I had a fiancé in one state while I worked in another about 4 hours apart. I had worked the third shift for a year and every weekend would drive to NYC to visit my girl. I was tired of this shit. I had an interview lined up near New York and began to formulate my plan to get time off. 2 days before the interview, and before I had asked for time off, we had a major layoff. Worst timing ever. I asked for a day off for an appointment, but was strongly denied. I called out the morning before my shift and straight up said I have a job interview in New York and will not be in. End of job. Worked out though. Happily married and have a good career going with a major snack food/soft drink company in the area/world.
Sounds like a rough situation with your job and the long distance. It's tough juggling work and personal life, especially with a fiancé waiting. At least you took that bold step for your future. That interview must have been nerve-wracking, but it's cool it all worked out in the end. Congrats on the marriage and your career. Sometimes you just gotta take risks for what really matters.
Not a manager, but this was funny. It was Christmas, I believe 2010, and I had recently gotten a job. I drive out to Alabama, about a 13-hour drive, to see my grandparents and was supposed to be back for the 26th. And it snowed, which meant Alabama was closed down. I got pulled over for driving and told to go home. Anyway, I called my boss, me. Hey, it snowed and they aren't letting people drive, so I won't be able to come in. Boss. I thought you were in Alabama? Me? I am. Boss. And it snowed? Me, yes. Boss. Yeah, okay. Well, you better hope it unsnows before your shift starts.
That's a pretty relatable moment. You think you're all set for the holidays, then a snowstorm flips everything upside down. The way your boss responded is classic. It's like they're expecting you to just will the snow away. It's tough to juggle family time and work, especially in weird weather. At least it sounds like you got a good story out of it, even if you had to deal with a little stress.
Sort of related. 2 weeks ago, my great-grandmother passed away. She lived in a retirement home. My aunt happened to work at that same retirement home. She asked for the day off for the funeral, and they said they couldn't give it to her because she doesn't have proof of death. The woman literally died in that very same retirement home.
That's a tough situation to deal with. It's crazy how some places have strict rules, even when it seems obvious. Your aunt must have felt really frustrated having to prove something like that. It's a weird contrast between the emotional weight of loss and the impersonal nature of bureaucracy. Just goes to show how sometimes the system doesn't understand personal tragedy.
When my aunt was working at Walmart, she called in sick and said, "I can't come in, my daughter broke her leg." Boss, I just saw your daughter come into the store. She needed nail polish. Aunt, oh, sorry, I meant my niece. Me, boss. Why don't you want to come into work again? Aunt, my niece broke her arm. Boss, I thought she broke her leg. Aunt, goddamn it, Clyde. I don't want to go to work today.
That's wild. Your aunt really put herself in a tough spot trying to get out of work. It's funny how quickly stories can change when you're desperate to avoid a shift. I've had moments like that with friends too, just trying to come up with excuses that spiral out of control. At the end of the day, honesty feels easier, but sometimes the pressure just makes you say whatever comes to mind.
A woman I supervised had planned a multi-week out-of-state vacation and had asked for the time off. I approved it. A few weeks before she left, we realized that she hadn't accrued enough vacation time for all of the time she wanted off by one day. She decided that she'd come back one day early, and that day was a Friday. Since it was a road trip and no flights had to be changed, I asked her if she'd rather leave a day later so that she'd have the weekend off too. That way she could extend her vacation by a couple of days. No, it's okay, she said. She'd be back in the office on Friday. Fast forward to early Friday morning, like 2:30 a.m. of the Friday, she was supposed to be back to work. She had called and left a voicemail on my work line with an extremely exaggerated hoarse voice telling me that she got back into town, but she was sick and wouldn't be able to come into work on Friday. Yeah, right. She showed up to work on Monday morning just as chipper as usual.
I had a friend who did something similar. She took time off for a big trip and planned to return on a Friday. Early that morning, she called in sick, sounding really rough. Fast forward to Monday, and she was totally fine, acting like nothing happened. It was hard not to laugh. Guess sometimes people just want a bit of extra time off, even if it means pretending to be sick.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.